Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Samhita, it's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you about this marvelous book, which I hope you'll all go out and buy if you haven't got copies already. I was sent an uncorrected proof and immediately plunged into it and simply read it over one night, which really meant an immersion in this incredible world of simultaneously action, love, devotion, quest, all the great epic themes, but told in what I can only think of as a kind of kaleidoscopic manner, because you take this story, which comes from the Shilapadikaram, a great Tamil epic, and then open it out. You open up the narratives of the various protagonists, and we are used to seeing that epic and experiencing it in a certain way. But what you've done is to make of it really, thank you so much, Nan, a thriller, if you will. And as we go along today, I would like us to maybe think about that process of how you work with epic material and then recast it. For instance, The Missing Queen also had a strong element of that. How do you, so to speak, translate it into genres that we know from a very different part of our experience? And I have to say that I was impelled to also go out and get a hold of the Shilapadikaram in the translation of Alain Danielou, who's in a sense your mentor from another world, so to speak, and I'll draw you out on that as well. Yeah. So let's begin with this question. What is it that's always drawn you, or so far has drawn you, to the epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, now the Shilapadikaram?
Thank you so much, Ranjit. And I have to let you all know, when the book has, the proofs had just gone out, and then I get this email from Ranjit, who I have admired from afar for many years and never really come close to in proximity to. Because I was so much in awe of him. And when I got this email saying that he had enjoyed the book, I can't tell you, that made my week, that made my year, that made up for many things in life. So thank you so much, Ranjit, and thank you for agreeing to be in conversation with me on this book. It means a great deal to me. I think the reason that I'm fascinated by the epics is in that many ways they are our foundational texts. When we talk about epics in terms of categories, there are these 38 signs and all of those sorts of things. An epic has to have a coronation and all of that. But even those categorizations sometimes leave out literature that's very foundational to our sense of culture. So after, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana very much interested in me, because I could see how my own kind of cultural belief systems, my own programming, my ideas of right and wrong gender roles come from an epic like the Ramayana. But the Mahabharata interests me in other ways, because I think it is a much more, it's a story of conflict and how to manage conflict within a family, within a political sphere in many respects. But how do you also make these texts accessible? The Shilapadikaram I became fascinated with it after 2012. Nirbhaya had happened, and it struck me, I was talking yesterday about Nabanita Dev Sen at her memorial, but that in many ways women's voices are sort of excluded from any discussion of literature, of classical texts, of epic texts. But in the Shilapadikaram and the Manimekala, you find the focus on women. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are stories of princes, of men. Yes, they're women characters, but they're not the primary focus or the driver of this narrative. When you come to Tamil literature, when you come to an epic like the Shilapadikaram, the main character is Kannagi, and she becomes such a cultural force that you have a statue of her built by the DMK, by Karunanidhi, that's poised on Marina Beach, and she becomes a symbol and an icon for justice, for democracy, for so many things. The Manimekalai similarly is also that kind of story of a woman, a common woman. She's still, bourgeoisie in some ways, but she is not an aristocrat. She is not a prince or a princess. She's a commoner who's challenging power. And for me, those sorts of epics, these epics, the Shilapadikaram, the Manimekalai, they have great relevance, I think, particularly for me in this time when a lot of questioning, a lot of challenging, a lot of speaking out has to happen. I think these characters can sort of serve us.
Also, because many of us are somehow conditioned one way or the other into thinking of all our past before a certain period as being Hindu, whatever this word means. It's not immediately obvious to people that some of these epics you named actually are Jain or Buddhist texts. So Do you want to talk a little bit about your engagement with those aspects of the original contexts of the Manimekalai and the Shilapadikaram? Because that also forms a thread in your narrative in The Prince.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. The Manimekalai is a Buddhist text. The Shilapadikaram is a Jain, we call it a Jain text. But what actually very interesting is that there's a crossover between both stories. Madhavi from the Shilapadikaram, she's a courtesan, a dancing girl. She has a child who is Manimekalai, who becomes the heroine of the Manimekalai, and she's Buddhist. So, and interestingly enough, Ilango Adigal, who we think is the author of the Shilapadikaram, means elderly, prince elder, prince ascetic, or prince monk, however you choose to interpret that, had a friend, so the story goes, called Satan, who goes on to, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing these names, who goes on to write the Manimekalai. And they're borrowing characters from each other. And that also fascinated me, that, we think of Jainism, Buddhism, Hinduism as all of these separate categories, but within Sangam literature, you have this crossover happening, and even Alyango Adigal is borrowing characters that were developed in the poems of his friends, Kapilar and Paranar, who are both writing about a different Kannagi. So there's all of that sharing, there's all of this sort of universal kind of cultural mix going on. But I think, particularly in these times when we talk about Hindu epics being the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, specifically the Ramayana, we also are forgetting that we do have other foundational stories. And a lot of these stories also challenge our ideas of power, of the paradigms of power. You have the Shilapadikaram and the Manimekalai coming out in Tamil. And I think, I was listening to a lecture the other day which talked about how a lot of the Prakrits and a lot of the languages other than Sanskrit often have these stories that contest Hinduism, that contest this kind of dominant narrative. So I think that way, this is also, these Buddhist stories are also important for us to realize that our history is much more complicated and not simplistic, and it offers us more narratives than we imagine.
Also, I was fascinated by the fact that the storyteller becomes your key figure, Ilango Adigal. In the original, it appears that he's more a parenthetical kind of figure. He's commenting, he is submerged in the text somehow. But your story is really the story of his journey, how he is pushed out into the world because of a certain decision he makes, and that launches him on this journey of quest, of loss, of physical damage, and then he's broken and remade in a certain way. And not a great deal is known about him, really, historically, right? Beginning with the paradox of that name, the Prince Ascetic. Yeah. So what was it that, why did he become the fulcrum of your story?
It was actually this was not the novel I intended to write. I intended to write a far more strategic novel, which would have focused on the Shilapadikaram and been a story of, a woman's rage, which would be timely in many respects. But as I started delving into the material, I got so much more interested by Ilango Adigal. Because here you have a prince who's choosing we have 2 paragraphs on him, which is basically, he was born into the Chera royal family. There's a great prophecy that says he should be king. He says, no, I'm not going to be king. I have an elder brother who should be king instead of me, and I will renounce my claim to the throne. In fact, I will, much like the Buddha, become a monk. And he goes off to become this Jain monk, but then goes on to write an extremely erotic epic featuring a love triangle with 2 women, and the women emerge as heroines in the story. And I was like, this man is, she's shifting all of my ideas of what kind of story would emerge from such a person. He's also writing this text in some ways for his brother, Shingutavan, who is the Chera king, who eventually does become that. And it's almost like when he talks about the story of Dharma coming to kings in the shape of death. Because in the Shilapadikaram, Kannagi questions the king, and the king, because he unjustly executes her husband, the king dies as a result, and Kannagi tears off her breast and burns down the city of Madurai, which is quite a gory end. But it's a story of what happens when justice is not served, or when the king fails to administer justice. And he is writing this text for his patron, who is his brother, who is a great king himself, as if to say, it seems to me, that if you do not administer justice, death will come to you. And I find that such a fascinating, this transformation of a prince who becomes a monk and then says, Dharma will come to royals who do not serve justice in the shape of a woman. Fascinating. So that's how he emerged, being the central point of the story.
I'm also fascinated by narratives or cartographies that upend our normal way of looking, or the way we're conditioned to look at the world. Like Egyptian cartography, which is canopic. You have to turn it around, so south becomes north. Or Al-Idrisi's maps. But also in your book, for instance, The Prince, it forces us to get away from our normal, I suspect for many of us, if not all of us. There's a way in which India gets conceived of from the Gangetic point of view. It's very north-centric. But here, the entire action is from a southern perspective, and I found that deeply fascinating, including when various rulers are said to have gone and conquered, say, the Himalayas, left their mark there, and so on. So, could you tell us about the research that went into evoking this world, which also was a world of transnational trade with the Mediterranean, with Southeast Asia? So what was the kind of research that went into the detail, building up the impasto detail, if you will, of the narrative?
Thank you for that. I feel sometimes you have to do a lot of guesswork when you're writing historical fiction, because you don't have necessarily all the material. So I went back, I read a lot of Sangam literature and translation. I spent a year and a half reading the Shilapatikaram with my aunt who reads Tamil, and I can't read Tamil, but I can understand a little bit of it. And we sat with 3 translations, trying to piece together which is the most authentic translation. I spent time at the home of Alan Daniel Liu, and so got to spend some time with the text and his thought process of working through that translation. But also, luckily, I had a fellowship, and I went to the UK, and I got to spend a lot of time hanging out with academics at SOAS and at the British Library who could point me in the direction of many resources. And something that we don't know about, but this is like this great moment, this something called the Calabaras interregnum that occurs, we think, in Tamil Nadu and South India between the 2nd to the 6th century. I mean, those dates are debatable. But from that time, we have this whole, glorious expanse of Sangam literature. And then there's sort of a dark age or a wipe out that happens between the 2nd to 6th century. They say that the Shilapatikaram and the Manimekalai could have also emerged at this time. But while we have a great deal of historical knowledge about the kings who ruled before, we don't have that in the Calabras interregnum. So the consensus that seems to emerge, this is just guesswork, is that it was a time of civil war. As you see the emergence of Jain and Buddhist thought happen in these epics, that this also contested power and authority, and literature in some ways reflects, the literature that's produced reflects those conflicts. So that became really fascinating because I'm partly Tamilian. My family, my last name is Arni. It's a town in Tamil Nadu. I don't know much about my history. I don't know much about my literature. So to go back and also to uncover, yes, I knew the Shilapatikaram growing up, but did I know what Sangam literature really was? And it's taken me many years, and I've been working with these texts for years for me to completely absorb the kind of conceptual system that Sangam literature seems to have, this idea of the inner and outer, and this is fascinating, particularly in a moment of climate change, because a lot of Tamil literature projects the internal states, emotions, psychological thoughts onto the external landscape. And there is a wedding that sort of happens, a merging between the inner and outer, between the landscape and the individual. And what a beautiful way of thinking about the world. I find like we think of the world oppositionally when I look in English. It's about man against nature. Here, there is none of that dichotomy. Yeah.
Because those are affective landscapes, the 5, or is it 6?
Yeah. I don't know.
And one of them is imagined. 5 of them are actual landscapes with their flora and fauna, but the last one is purely affective. And the way in which the individual sensibility or consciousness is linked to what happens outside. It's like an ethic, that if you damage your environment, you're going to damage yourself. It's a very tightly linked kind of concept. But I've been fascinated by the Calabras because, again, one had heard of them as a kind of trace. And sometimes when you go after the trace, you actually find amazing things. Like the Kushans they got barely half a page in most of our history books, but it's actually the most productive period. But what also fascinates me in your book is that alongside the sensuousness of the erotic, the Shringara, if you will, there are amazing evocations of war. And I have very plebeian taste in cinema. Well, my friends were watching Tarkovsky, I was watching Sam Peckinpah, so I have a great fascination with war scenes. So could I invite you to read that amazing passage where, where you talk about, where you dwell on, it's an amazing moment. It marks the destruction of a civilization. Because vast as Sangam literature is, it is said to be only that which remains after the Calabria interregnum. Right? Could you read that passage maybe?
Thank you, and I think we have the similar tastes in cinema. I have to say, I'm quite plebeian myself.
Horribly highbrow taste. Sam Peckinpah's lowbrow.
Okay. Uthien wandered. So this is close to the end of it, and this is the destruction of the Sangam. Uthien wandered as if in a dream through scenes of desecration. Also the destruction of Madurai. Each room told a similar story. Bloodstains on the floor, figures lying down, claimed by death. Soldiers and commoners alike, scurrying quickly down corridors, gems and priceless objects clutched tightly in their hands. Uthien's heart sank. War, no matter what the cause, the pretext seemed to always look the same story each time. How often had his father done this? Had his brother done this? Outside the palace, the silver Patimandapam, the source of so much of Madurai's glory and greatness, was on fire. The silver walls were alight with red gold flames. A crowd had gathered, and to Uthien's surprise, they cheered. As he watched, a soldier ran past him, his arms full of scrolls, towards the fire. "Wait!" Uthien called out. "What are you doing with these?" The soldier paused for an instant. "Burning them." Uthien gasped. "You can't!" The soldier responded with a leery grin. "Commander's orders. We're burning all of these." As he spoke, he edged towards the fire, and Uthien, following him, was appalled to see pile upon pile of scrolls and palm leaf manuscripts withering to ashes in the flames. The crowd cheered again as the soldier tossed his bundle of scrolls into the fire. "Why are you doing this?" Uthien shouted, appalled. "These are priceless." The soldier examined the scroll closely. Just a bunch of words. "These are famous poems. The king spent so much on poems and poetry, but nothing on his own people," a voice called out from the crowd. Uthien whirled around. "That's right," another man exclaimed. "We saw the gifts he gave poets who sang well of him. Golden flowers and food and expensive garments, elephants even. And for what? For poems that praised him." "No, it was more than that." Uthien whipped around to stare up. "This was the seat of the Sangam, this." But the crowd had no patience for Uthien. "All those poets lived off the king," another voice piped in angrily. "Those poems are not for us, and now all of those poets have fled. Why do you want to preserve that? Those are just empty verses." Uthien stared in anguish at the fire spreading up the building, winding like a creeper along the length, up and down the pillars, chasing down the seats where the 49 had sat, across the scrolls and the manuscripts of the best works that poets had produced for centuries. Exquisite poems, manuals of dance and art and poetry, histories and treatises, all of it turning to ash. All of it, the beauty, the glory, the pain, the love of the past. The house of the Sangam that he had heard of for years, whose tales had filled his dreams, whose poems traveling up and down the length of Tamilaham, entertaining both courts and villages alike. How could he explain it to these people, what they stood to lose in the anger of a moment? This was terrible. He lurched towards the fire, picking up a tattered palm leaf here and another there, struggling to preserve what he could. "Stop him!" he heard a voice cry out from behind him. He ignored it. A soldier pulled him roughly from the fire. Uthien turned to him, desperate, cradling the few leaves he had managed to rescue in his arms. "Help me!" "Who are you to tell me what to do?" the soldier retorted. Uthien had had enough. The bloodshed, the looting, the pointless deaths, and now this. He pulled himself to his full height and in his most imperious manner shot back. "I am your king!" The soldier snorted. Uthien was incensed. "You heard your commander on the battlefield." "I heard him and I heard you as well. And then later on the battlefield I saw you didn't even lift your sword." "That's right," another voice explained. Uthien turned to see another soldier, a belligerent gleam in his eye, advance towards him. "That's not the kind of king I want to fight or live under. Who are you, princeling, to tell us what to do when you cannot even wield a sword?" Blazing with fury, Uthien replied, "You are an idiot." He turned to face the crowd, teeth gritted in anger. "You are all idiots," he shouted. "Heard that? He called us idiots. Who does he think he is?" The crowd broke then in unison, charging towards Uthien. The soldier was the one who got there first. "You had it coming," he said as he punched Uthien in the guts. Blows rained on Uthien. And I'll stop there. Okay.
moving now from the book to your own journey. You've spent the better part of a year in a country where pretty much this happened, not so long ago, right? Could I draw you out on what took you to Afghanistan and what was the experience of being there and developing a network of friendships and collegial connections?
Thank you for that. I was there only for 6 months, so it was not that long. But I think I was drawn there because I'd spent part of my childhood. I spent about 3 years living in Pakistan. My father was with the RAW, and he had also been, not anymore. He had been a negotiator on IC-814. So he had gone to Kandahar at the time when the Taliban was still in existence. And through him, I had heard many stories of Afghanistan. So I think when the opportunity came for me to go there, I went there. I got a job and I went there. But I think it was also for me to understand how powerful stories can be. So I was working for a TV station there, and they were creating soap operas and television series with the idea that that through stories, through what you put out on television, through even having music on a screen, you can reverse some sort of cultural erosion that has happened. You can bring back, through having a competition where the best singer wins, you can bring back the idea that in a democracy, because people have to vote in and call in for the best singer, you have to vote for the most talented or the best candidate. So I was really interested in how that kind of, how the way we look at stories or entertainment, how they structure us and how they play out in terms of the kind of messaging, the kind of culture that they build. I felt also for me, I was also at a point in my life where I was struggling to understand what role words can play, what role stories can play in shaping the kind of moment we live in and how we can respond to that moment. So that way, Afghanistan was very interesting and very formative for me. But I came back, some of my friends know this, with post-traumatic stress disorder. It took me a couple of years to get over that. I had lost friends. I lost friends in terrorist attacks who died then and who died later. Somebody I knew lost, not only was he shot, but his wife was shot, and their children were shot. The youngest child survived, but the rest of the family died. And I think it was heartbreaking. And you come back with that scarred. I feel some of my own experience of understanding what war can do. And that also played out when I read the Srila Patikaram and I went and examined that history. And it's on that cusp. And there's this great destruction and this great cultural erosion that seems to happen afterwards. I used my experience to explore that.
You've also explored different kinds of forms. You've explored the graphic novel, what I think of as a thriller or a mystery story. Now this, which is more like historical fiction. Is that a wager on different kinds of audiences or to different dimensions of an unpredictable reader? How does it play out for you?
I think I'm trying to make it more accessible or engaging, because I myself sometimes wade through texts like the Srila Patikaram. I waded through 3 translations of the Srila Patikaram, and these are not easy texts to engage with. If I take them into a classroom, I find all my students, most of them who don't like reading, kind of staring at me blankly. So I think I'm also writing in a way, using these mediums to access particularly the kind of readers my students are. Like, be interested in your past, and let me try to find a form, a thriller or a graphic novel, whatever it could be, to engage you more in this literature, so much so that you yourself are driven to go and explore it and find yourself in it. So that's why I use that kind of form. And I also like plots. I'm a very plot-driven kind of a person, so I like that form.
Also, now to get back to the book, is there a passage that pertains to Kannagi? Because for us, those of us who've known the epic, she shines forth as the kind of pivot of this. So could you evoke her for us in your telling, in a passage, and then I might have 1 or 2 things to ask about how you came to this.
Can I do a slightly subversive thing? So the thing that was another great discovery for me was that during in the Sangamera, you don't have just the Srila Patikaram Kannagi. You have another Kannagi, and unlike the Kannagi of the Srila Patikaram, this one's a queen. And this was really interesting. And she was a queen very much like the Kannagi of the Shilapatikaram. They're both having husbands who go off after other women, dancing girls, and they're both very upset about this. And it seems to me that Ilango Adigal, he definitely knew. He knew Kapila and he knew Paranar, who both wrote of her. Paranar was the poet patronized by his brother as well, and he's mentioned in the Shilapatikaram, so they would have talked about the gossip of court. So it seemed to me like this was a historical Kannagi. So I kind of, re-invoked her here somewhere. I think this is it. He's in love with her. So the king, this is Velpekan, who is the husband of Kannagi, says, and they're discussing Uthiyan, who's the name I gave Ilango Adigal here. He's in love with her, don't you know? A slight creaking. Uthiyan imagined that above, on the swing, Pekin shifted uneasily. With who? The courtesan. Perhaps. The swing creaked again, and it seemed as if the king was uncomfortable in his seat beside Kannagi. Maybe we can use them with the Kalabaras. Is that right? What you are meddling with can come back to bite you. Pekin replied curtly, it is not your place to question me. That is not the order of wives. But it is my place to care, Kannagi objected. It is my place to advise you because I love you. Pekin did not reply. The silence grew and the queen spoke again, her voice contrite. Husband, what is this, Kannagi? To Uthiyan, the king sounded more than merely irritated. He sounded weary. Do you care for the feelings of the prince, or are you jealous of another woman? Another short pause. I speak out of love for you. Uthiyan heard the words, but they sounded strained, as if Kannagi was gritting her teeth. Could it be that she was jealous, or that she was worried about him? Or both? Love. It was the king who spoke, a trace of bitterness in his tone. Your love is like a noose around my neck and yours. His voice rose angry. Your love is so bold as to advise me what to do when the fate of the world hangs in the balance. My husband, I only seek to counsel you, for I am not merely a queen, I am also the daughter of kings. And I know this much, Dharma comes to all. Dharma visits kings, most often in the shape of death, and I fear that for you. Kannagi! You have me do the right thing, but what is it that is in my interest and that of my kingdom? These two things are not always the same. The right course of action does not always bring profit and peace to me, my kingdom or my people. It was this idea also of Kannagi questioning the king. So the Queen Kannagi is also a questioner of the king's power.
Then there's the woman who's at the far side of the life of desire and anticipation and disappointment. Kavunti, right, is the nun. I found her fascinating. In your cast of characters, it was often the people who seemed like catalysts or only apparently peripheral who turn out to be really like guides, or they cast illumination on what happens next. Tell me about your writerly fascination with this kind of figure. The courtesan who becomes a nun, who yet retains deep knowledge of how courts work and how men think and so on. Could I draw you out on that? Because I found her a very fascinating figure.
So that the Kavanti of the Shilapatikaranam is kind of different. She's just a mentor in some ways to Kovalan and Kannagi in their journey from Kaveripatna, Puhar to Madurai. But there's another Tamil epic that exists only in fragments called the Kundala Kesi. And then we have another, and it seems to be related to the story of a nun who also appears in the Terigata, who was, Yeah. And she's a courtesan, she's a beautiful woman, and then suddenly she seems to have a husband who, this is a hagiography that's constructed around the verses, but who tries to kill her. And she pushes him off a cliff. And then on the descent down, she sort of becomes enlightened and becomes a great teacher and goes out into the world. And there seems to be a Tamil epic based on this character, but that's now lost. But I thought, let me use a little bit of what we know, and let me use a little bit from the footnotes kind of in the Terigata. I mean, it's a kind of, and construct a figure out of this. So she then transformed into this courtesan who had become a nun and was kind of another foil for a Madhavi, because Madhavi's daughter goes through that journey as well. So I was also interested in breaking these boundaries between sensual and spiritual. We see them in our contemporary, I think Arundhati and Amruta were talking about that today, that these categories are very bifurcated in our present understanding. But I think even for Elango Adigal, who's writing essentially a poem, a great epic about a love triangle, these were not so separate. So to also come back to that the other side of the courtesan is the ascetic woman. And that quite interested me. There's a wonderful play by Mahendravarman Pallava, the great Pallava king, where there's a yogi and a courtesan, and then their souls, and everyone's thinking the yogi is great and all of that, and the courtesan is fleecing. You come with that impression, and then you swap, and the courtesan's soul enters the body of the yogi, and the yogi's soul enters the body of the courtesan, and that's when the body and the soul are in alignment. So it was quite an interesting, that perspective is quite interesting.
Because it reminds us that the kind of binaristic either or that we're now being forced into is really a Cartesian idea. It's a Western idea. But we're being presented with this as if it comes from our ancient past, but it doesn't. So the way in which you've approached this notion of the dvandva, the interplay of opposites, the kind of collage, also your technique, the kind of collage and palimpsest models that you work with, in a way it extends this epic tradition. It extends the way in which these poets originally worked. So for me, that's incredibly fascinating. And also because the arc of today has had so much to do with translation. In its own way, to me, this is a new translation of the epic. So I would also maybe see it as it could be seen as part of the genre of translation. But those are the thoughts that I thought I'd put into play. But we have about 4 minutes left, right? So we have time for questions. People who have questions for Samhita are invited to speak now. Keshava. Is there a mic that can travel?
No, I was wondering if you could say more about your relationship with Alain Danielou, because Ranjit, of course, referenced it early on. And he's, apart from being a outstanding Indologist, is also someone that people now think of as, an apologist for Hinduism or for the caste system and whatnot. So, but there's much more to him than that, right? So could you just say more about your relationship with him and his work?
Yeah, at Danielou again is this this character of opposites, this either
charlatan
kind of
genius.
Charlatan genius. We were talking about him earlier, and we used the word charlatan genius, which is precisely what it is. Because I am on record. I think he's a genius. He is, and I was very kind. I got a residency to go and work out of his home, and it's a beautiful place in Zagarulo. But it's also I loved his life story, because he's this guy who comes from this aristocratic French family who kind of runs away from his family. His brother becomes this huge cardinal in the Catholic Church, and then goes on to have and writes all these brilliant theological tracts, but drops dead on the doorstep of a prostitute with a check in his hand. So, which leads us to everyone to speculate that the great theologian was on his way to visit the prostitute with money in his hand. Who knows? So there was this huge scandal.
To do good works.
Which we all need. But Danielou himself is kind of, his mother comes from this extremely conservative religious upbringing. She's a friend of Pope Pius, I believe. Danielou has all these spiritual experiences as a child, but then runs away, becomes a dancer in Paris, has a stream of affairs with all these beautiful young men, and with one goes off to India, and they go travel in a caravan with this aristocratic servant. In this aristocratic fashion, with a servant in the back of the caravan, and they come to Khajuraho, and they see Khajuraho. They kind of discover the eroticism there, and it's really a fascinating story. He himself is this great spiritualist, great eroticist. He's teetering on so many things, that Dionysian kind of, writes so much about Dionysius that, there is that aspect to him as well. So I found him fascinating too. And I think when I was there, and the Silapadikaram changed for me. It was also about these great creative forces and energies that kind of come out of living life in that style. I want some of that too in my life.
Arundhati, do you have a question? A mic needs to travel to Arundhati. No? Okay, is there anyone else? Okay, there's a question there.
Hello, good evening. My name is Sunil. I want to ask that when you start writing, do you have a complete plot before you, or when you start writing and continue writing, the plot gets developed?
That's a great question. So I'm a believer in plot, but I think that there is a structure that if you have intuited well enough, if you've read enough books, and I myself am a student of structure. I love reading. We were talking about Jung the other day, and I think that Jung is very interesting because he's talking about psychology, but those same principles. Joseph Campbell takes those same principles and applies them to his study of mythology and discovers a structure that he talks about in the hero's journey. And George Lucas later goes and reads Joseph Campbell, who has read Jung, and then produces Star Wars. So, and this is the great, like an epic. And if you watch, Keshava was talking about Harry Potter. If you read any of these kind of narratives, in some ways, they have aspects of the hero's journey. So I feel like if I internalize aspects of this, then when you approach a story, your story takes its own shape. You know that it has to go through these dark points, these emotional arcs. It has to reach a kind of resolution in the end. So now when I approach a story, I know that I have to hit those kinds of moments. I might not know exactly what happens, but I know there has to be a dark, there has to be this, tension has to escalate, it has to reach, there has to be a sense of completion at the end of the story, in the journey of the primary protagonist. So I use those as landmarks when constructing.
I was once listening to one interview of James Patterson. He's written 150 novels, or over 150 novels. So he mentioned that, suppose he has to write a novel worth about 700, 800 pages. He writes about 90 pages of initial plot, complete plot, and then develops it. So I just wanted to know that.
Woodhouse has a similar thing. Woodhouse's plots used to be longer than his novels themselves. Yeah, they were longer than the novels. They didn't, yeah.
There was a big difference. James Patterson doesn't actually write his own novel. He has 4 employees who write the book for him. He just writes the plot.
How many employees do you have, Samhita?
Me and my 2 cats.
Pinto, was that a question?
It seems like an extremely conscious way of putting things together. Would you do a Danielu book novel?
Yeah, that's exactly what
The Danielu novel is waiting to be written, obviously.
No comment.
On that joyous note. Okay, that's the very last question. You're all idiots, it says. Jesus. Maybe I should unleash the one Tamil word that I know, poyache. Does that mean get lost? No, I made that up? Okay. Sorry. Okay, on that note, thank you so much, Samhita, for sharing your book and your process. Great.
Thank you, Ma'am Samhita and Sir Ranjit, for the wonderful session. Audience, kindly note, the next session will begin at 4 p.m.